Hello and welcome to the Weekly Artifact. This is a tri-weekly podcast created by two friends who met in undergrad and against all odds decided to keep talking to each other. I'm your host Alex, who in 2014 was, quote, the only white person my co-host ever known to have watched the Boondock animated series.
I'm Justin. The internet moves fast. The hot takes of today are less than a distant memory by tomorrow. We're here to slow down and recover the content that's been lost along the way in order to make sense of where the world was, where it is, and where it will be. To that end, we've each chosen an artifact from the web to discuss together.
Our comments are our own and are not associated with any institution. The show may contain explicit language or themes, so see the show notes for specific content warnings. Justin, what's your artifact for the week?
So my artifact, which I have to say has the distinction of being the oldest artifact.
Stop doing this! You're gonna make me go harder! I'm already so bad at picking artifacts, god damn it.
This has the distinction of being the oldest artifact to date. So my artifact is I Won't Vote by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it came out in 1956. So it was about the election in that year. Which I will say off the bat, so I mean, Du Bois lived to be super old. In 1956, he was actually.
I was gonna say, I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, in 1956, he was actually already 88 years old when he wrote this. But so he says for his whole life up to that point, he'd been voting third party if the main parties were unsatisfactory or voting lesser of two evils. But always paying attention to basically how the candidates thought, what they thought of black people was sort of his barometer. And then he sort of talks about some of his different decisions and why he made them. He talks also about sort of, just being the disenfranchisement of black people, especially in the South, and how sometimes it would be easier or harder for him to vote. Yeah, so he talks about basically what he started building up to. He starts giving critiques of democracy, and he's sort of suggesting that democracy doesn't really exist in America necessarily. So he says, in 1956, I shall not go to the polls. I have not registered. I believe that democracy has so far disappeared in the United States that no two evils exist. There is but one evil party with two names, and will be elected despite all I can do or say. And he sort of talks about some reasons why he sort of thinks that is. And I think one important thing to remember is that this is sort of at the tail end of the Red Scare of McCarthyism. And so he sort of talks about how anyone who sort of is, advocating for too significant of reform is going to be labeled a communist, and at this time could even end up in jail because of that. I mean, Du Bois himself had some personal experience with that, which I will talk about afterward. And he sort of talks about the issue of money in politics, but he just talks about how much it costs to elect a senator and presidents, and says this money comes from the very corporations which today are the government. This in a real democracy would be enough to turn the party responsible out of power, yet this we cannot do. And he talks about, so the 1956 election was between Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower. So he sort of talks about their positions and basically suggesting that they don't actually differ that much. He does have one quote where he says, even in domestic affairs, how does Stevenson differ from Eisenhower? He uses better English than Dulles, thank God, which I think Dulles is John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State under Eisenhower, which is just kind of funny because we still sort of talk about how presidents can or can't speak.
Yeah.
So, he has a quote here. He says, I have no advice for others in this election. Are you voting Democratic? Well and good. All I ask is why. Are you voting for Eisenhower and his smooth team of bright ghostwriters? Again, why? Will your helpless vote either way support or restore democracy to America? He also talks about how he sort of sees his position as being a more hopeful one. He says, it is hoped that if 25 million voters refrained from voting in 1956 because of their own accord, and not because of a sly wink from Khrushchev, this might make the American people ask how much longer this dumb farce can proceed without even a whimper of protest. which is a good quote for a couple of reasons, but also because just the idea of Russian interference on the left again. We can sort of we can talk about more. I don't mean to get into too much analysis here. And he gets a little bit get off my lawn sort of towards the end. But then
Nothing wrong with that.
basically, yeah, just basically saying in the concluding paragraph that, you know, whoever you vote for will make no difference, he says. Stop yelling about democracy we do not have. And then the final quote, or final line of the article, when again we can hold a fair election on real issues, let's vote, and not till then. Is this impossible? Then democracy in America is impossible. So that's the artifact. Again, always recommend reading them for yourselves. Yeah, so I think, well, you know, by the time this episode comes out, you know, maybe it will be election season again when this episode comes out. But
Hey, now.
at the time of recording, we're still sort of. I want to say the election has just ended, but maybe that's a little bit too optimistic. The election's been called within the last week. Was when we're recording this, and so actually we won't. Yeah, Alex's artifact was also election related, so we'll try and restrict our conversation a little bit more to this. Oh, so yeah, the earlier context of the other one's obviously a little bit later than this one. So yeah, I thought there was a bunch of stuff that was interesting about this one. You know, obviously we could talk about the overall argument of whether or not it makes sense to vote and sort of in what situations it makes sense to vote. I did a lot of sort of historical looking into some of these things. It is so this election, like I said, was between Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the incumbent at this point, which actually this was they also ran against each other in 1952, which is interesting. I don't think you would really see that anymore. A candidate who just lost going. It would be like it's basically like if Hillary Clinton was the nominee for the Democrats again in 2020. Like that's
fucking imagine.
But yeah, it's interesting. This election also feels like sort of a good one to sort of, if you're going to argue that elections don't really matter, just because, I mean, yeah, I'm sure, like, I'm not like a historian of this period per se, but I think probably the most significant thing that comes out of Eisenhower's second term is the Little Rock Nine, where Eisenhower sort of authorizes the National Guard to basically enforce Brown versus Board of Education to allow African Americans into integrated schools. And from what I could look up, Stevenson actually also said he supported the Brown decision, and Eisenhower actually didn't express support for it, although Stevenson would not commit to, basically he wouldn't commit to like spending any federal money on it. But point being, it seems like that was probably like the one thing where we could say, well, maybe whoever was in office might have depended, although it sort of seems like Stevenson was leaning the same way that Eisenhower ultimately ended up going there. But I don't think we really think about the Eisenhower presidency as necessarily like, you know, if Stevenson had won, I don't really think we would be in a radically different position than we are now. So I think, because I guess I'm sort of previewing. I think I might, you know, I'll be curious which way you go, but I might go slightly the opposite way when we get to your artifact. But anyways, I've been talking too long. I have more to say, but I'll let you jump in here.
Well, when I was reading it, I like because he was hitting all these like hard notes that you were sort of like saying as you read through like these like sort of repeated things that apparently they've been talking about for since at least fucking 56. But like the only line that this dude was missing, that like he literally Du Bois don't miss, but the only thing that he was missing was at some point being told that this is the most important election of his life every 4 years. It's the only key point that I needed to just fully get like the full house like flush, royal flush, fucking perfect hand of absolute sniper shot from half a century ago.
Yeah, I mean, it really is kind of incredible how much of the talking points from back during this time are still very alive and well. And I think part of it is, just because we haven't fully escaped the Red Scare, even though, you know, officially it sort of ended. I think a lot of especially that one paragraph where he's talking about sort of being labeled a communist. So, I mean, just for background, Du Bois, I'm not a Du Bois scholar per se. Some of what I do sort of privies me to at least some aspects of his life, but not necessarily this part of his life. But yeah, I mean, Du Bois basically, over the course of his life, sort of moves further to the left, you can say, starts embracing sort of Marxist or communist ideas more. Towards the end of his life, he's talking more explicitly about socialism and things like that. There's even a recording of his actual voice where he's talking about socialism. And so when he hasn't mentioned in this article, but he's talking about how, you can be labeled a communist and stuff. And so he was part of a group that basically was put on trial they accused them of being an agent of a foreign state, but not registering as such. And eventually the case got dismissed. So he didn't get arrested or anything, although obviously, he could have been, plenty of people were.
Mm-hmm.
But he did get his passport. They took his passport, they revoked it for 8 years. After he got back, he ended up going to Ghana, where he died and is buried.
Just like the idea when he mentions that like 17 states in 1952 had a socialist party on the ballot for the president. I was like, that seems even radical to today, considering how much fucking flack and bullshit Bernie got just for like claiming to be a democratic socialist. And they're just like, yeah, you can just vote socialist, dude. Like, what the fuck? What a time to be alive in the middle of Vietnam, the good old days.
Mm-hmm. So he ran. So in 1950, when he was 82, he ran for senator in New York on the American Labor ticket, and then in 1961, which is just a few years before he dies. Oh, sorry, he died in 1963. So just 2 years before he dies is when he joins the Communist Party in 1961, and he's 93 years old, which is obviously after this article comes out. He was. So point being, he was sort of involved in all that stuff. So he's sort of speaking from experience when he's talking about that. And I think some of the rhetoric has shifted a little bit, but I think the sentiments are all still there. I think now it sort of just gets labeled as like being a radical leftist or whatever. I mean, I think you still get some. Well, I feel like mostly like more obscure Republicans will still frame it as communism, but like if you watch the Trump-Biden debates, Trump would always just talk about the radical left and stuff like that, and sometimes he'll talk about socialism. I don't think we really see it framed necessarily as communism in those explicit words, but yeah, I mean, it's like anything that's he says. Anything he advocates by way of significant reform will be called communist and will of necessity be communist in the sense that it must advocate such things as government ownership of the means of production, government and business, the limitation of private profit, social medicine, government housing and federal aid to education, the total abolition of race bias, and the welfare state. I mean, if you look at the stuff that gets labeled radical left, it's like Black Lives Matter. He talks about the abolition of race bias. Medicare for all. He talks about social medicine. Talks, just anything basically government sort of either ownership or regulation of business. That stuff. Some of that stuff is like more explicitly communist or socialist or whatever you want to say than others, but all of that is still the same exact stuff that's getting dismissed as being too far to the left. And if you support it, then you're again like literally like an agent of Russia. They just changed it from Khrushchev to Putin.
Right. Like you've been saying, like I've been saying, it's just alarming how much of it's been like just like more of the same bullshit. And like lo and behold, just as it's a problem in 2020, it seems it was a problem in 2000 as well.
Yeah, you sort of mentioned how there was like you could vote for socialists then. He does talk about towards the beginning how sometimes there is no third party option, which actually the state I'm in, the Green Party was not on the ballot, although
Was the Libertarian Party
the
on?
Libertarian Party was on, yes. So I know in some states, and I don't know if this is in my state, but I know in some states the Democrats like fought to get the Green Party off the ballot, basically. But some states I know they were I mean, you could always write them in, and I know from just stuff that they were posting on social media, there were some states where they were. I guess they're always appear as write-in states. Again, I'm not totally sure. The point is that yeah, so it's interesting how there's still sometimes no third party. He's talking about that back then, and we could sort of see the lengths to which the certain parties will go to get other parties removed as well, which is something we'll talk about in your artifact as well. Yeah, I mean, I think the point about money in politics was also an important point. Yeah, I think I've just been thinking a lot since our own election of how much, not even necessarily like money funding the politicians even, but also just thinking about the money that goes into convincing people who to vote for. Like I just think that like there, if I have someone who's like a Trump supporter on social media or whatever, and I try and like figure out, okay, like why is this person a Trump supporter? And I like look at the stuff that they're sharing. It's like from Breitbart or whatever, and it's like if you look at who's funding that, it's like okay, this person has like Breitbart's funded by Robert Mercer, who's just like a hedge fund, like a hedge fund owner. Who's I mean, he also is like racist, but but obviously he's gonna be promoting stuff that he feels like is gonna make him money or whatever. So I mean, that's how you end up with. I think if people thought a little bit more about how money is influencing politics in like a variety of ways, that could be helpful. And I'm not even like, yeah, it's like Breitbart too, but even like, look at who's funding CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Like, I think it tells you a lot about, what policies they will sort of frame as being acceptable. Okay, two last points here. I sort of mentioned it, but I do like how he frames not voting as something hopeful. I think there's a lot of sentiment around not voting that sort of frames it as being nihilistic or whatever, but I do think there's something to it of you're sort of holding out that we can get better options than this. We shouldn't settle. I think that's important to keep in mind. And then last point, I really like where he sort of leaves off by sort of saying, if we can't hold out for better options, then we really don't have democracy worth speaking about, which I think is true. I mean, if we're at the point where it's like you have to vote for one of these two people, even though you don't like them, in what meaningful way is that really democracy? Which, I don't know. I mean, some people, don't really like democracy, and I'm not even necessarily just talking about the people who think Trump won the election. Like, obviously, they don't like democracy either. But I mean, there are people who are like, we'll say democracy just doesn't work in practice or whatever. But if you do think of yourself as someone who supports democracy, I think it's worth considering what that really means, what that should look like. So I sort of like him leaving off there as well. That's all I have to say about it.
I think you covered it well. So my artifact is this may be the second oldest artifact.
I think so. Yeah, I don't think we have anything else that's from the 20th century. So
from the article is the 2000 elections. The Green Party, angry Democrats fearing Nader cost them the election race, threatened to retaliate. By James, was that Dow? I'm gonna say Dow. By James Dow, written on November 9th, 2000, so fresh off the election. Published by the not yet failing New York Times. I'm just sort of starting the first, just reading the first, paragraph. Liberal Democrats today angrily threaten retribution against Ralph Nader and his Green Party allies as Vice President Al Gore was declared the loser in the too close to call presidential election. Nader won just 3% of the nationwide vote, but his total in the closely contested states of Florida, Oregon, and New Hampshire were well above the margins there between Mr. Gore and Governor George W. Bush. Pre-election polling around the country had found that if Mr. Nader were not in the race, perhaps half his supporters would back Mr. Gore. Others said they did not know what they would do in the event of a Naderless race, though some said they would vote Mr. Bush. And so the article goes on to say, with the race hanging in the balance today as ballots are counted in Oregon, recounted in Florida, and studied in New Hampshire, where Mr. Bush was already declared the winner, staunch Democrats and their liberal allies attacked Mr. Nader for having refused to bow out of the race weeks ago. And regardless of the outcome, they said Mr. Nader's once stellar reputation amongst liberals has been permanently tarnished. His ability to raise money and to work with Democrats forever damaged. And taking a quote from presidential-elect Joseph R. Biden Jr., then Senator of Delaware, echoes the sentiment of several other Democrats on Capitol Hill, saying, quote, Ralph Nader is not going to be welcome anywhere near the corridors. Nader cost us the election. Other Democrats argued that if Mr. Bush won the election, Nader would be held responsible for jeopardizing the well-being of gays and lesbians, minorities, and the poor women and organized labor. Quote, because of him and his activities, there is a possibility that the people we represent can be harmed, can be hurt, and that our agenda that we fought for may not take place, said Gerald McGinty, president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees and chairman of the AFL-CIO Political Committee. However, sort of pushing back at a news conference in Washington, Nader argued that Democrats in Congress might actually be more effective with a Republican in the White House calling President Clinton a, quote, snake charmer who had weakened their resolve. And he asserted that he was not worried about threats of retribution because, quote, citizen groups in the country have been shut out already by Democratic administration that he said cared more about campaign fundraising than progressive causes. Quote, I don't think people have realized how much ground has been lost by citizen groups in the last 20 years, Nader said. Nader sort of reaffirms that, saying, quote, even if the Democratic Party returned to its roots, it needs a progressive third party to make sure it stays there. He said, it's like an insurance policy. However, the article says that Democratic congressional candidates have already begun feeling the impact of the Green Party, which Nader was representing at the time. Deb Callahan was president of the League of Conservation Voters, which is an environmental group that endorsed Mr. Gore, and argued that the Green Party candidates had siphoned off enough Democratic votes to help elect Republicans in at least 3 House races on Tuesday. Quoting Ms. Callahan, clearly there were some races where strong environmental candidates were threatened or even defeated because of a green candidate that's just not acceptable. And several Democrats said today that they were expecting many longtime financial supporters of Mr. Nader to cut off their contributions to organizations with which he was affiliated. Closing out the article, the author writes, Mr. Nader's campaign also seems to have caused squabbling within the Green movement itself, an Oregon-based group called Greens for Gore, whose members included a founding member of the Green Party, issued a blistering statement today accusing Mr. Nader of running a, quote, reckless, irresponsible, and totally counterproductive campaign. And Judy DeCastro, a Seattle city councilwoman with both Green and Democratic ties, said she had scrapped plans to try to mediate peace talks between the two in Washington. I am too angry and disgusted, Ms. McCastro said. I know I don't have it in me to be big enough to forgive Nader right now. And that's sort of the end of the article. And there's, sort of like Justin's, there's a lot of things that sort of we see nowadays that we saw back then, we see 20 years ago. Some of the things to talk about, before I give the floor to Justin, just topics that sort of saw my interest were sort of the the infighting even between sort of more left-leaning groups that we sort of see even maybe more on social media. The idea of third-party votes costing a candidate, or that blaming the third party for when one of the two main party tickets loses, and sort of the backlash and the sort of demonizing that the third party candidates get from one of the two major parties that they're sort of more closely affiliated with, in the sense here being Green Party with the Democrats, and on the other side, Libertarians with the more conservative and the Republican Party. But I'll sort of let Justin say what he's thinking first, and we'll sort of talk it through. Shout out to Joe Biden.
Yeah, I feel like this is...
Shout out to Daddy Biden.
I feel like this is sort of like the Brianna Joy Gray article from the other week, in that it is like, I mean, the timing on this is a little bit more spaced out, but in the sense that I brought up someone that wasn't necessarily as relevant at the time, but that is now relevant in the moment. But yeah, I don't know. There's a bunch of stuff that jumped out. I think maybe I'll just start with my biggest point from the article, which is just that there's this weird cognitive dissonance, maybe. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but where it's like all these Democrats are like, it's unacceptable that Nader didn't drop out. Like, we're not going to get our policies now, blah, blah. But there's no, like, explanation for why. Like, if it's so unacceptable, why didn't Gore drop out? That was the thing that kept, like, striking me. It's like, you're saying, I mean, I could see, like, I'm not saying that Gore should have dropped out, but I'm saying, like, you can't say this is unacceptable, but then also be like, but we also enabled it by not dropping out either.
Right.
It's like, you can't, like, if that was such a bad outcome that you should have done something extreme and dropped out. Obviously, you didn't care that much, or like because you still
Right.
like if you thought it was going to happen, you did nothing to stop it. Then how much did you
I'm
really
not going to
care?
drop out.
Yeah, it's just this sense of entitlement where it's like, well, you know, we're the Democrats. I mean, and again, you could say like, well, you know, they had the better polling numbers. It wouldn't make sense for the person that's polling higher to drop out or whatever. Like, that's fine to an extent, but there's no self-reflection to be like, you know, we also are sort of enabling this by like the votes for Gore, or sorry, the votes for Nader are just as valid as the votes for Gore. Like, that's not something that crosses their mind.
And I think to that extent too, I mean, they say that they like, I don't know who, like, they did some polling around like who Nader supporters would have voted for instead, and like perhaps half of the supporters would have backed Gore. Others say they didn't know what they do, and some said they would vote for Mr. Bush. You would assume, I mean, I don't know, but like it's just as likely that a Gore voter would vote Nader as a Nader voter would vote Gore. Anyways, it's not like we don't have like this like sealed in deal. They're clearly voting third party for a reason, whether they agree with Nader the most or they don't like either person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the other big assumption too, which I think is one that we still see to this day, obviously, where it's just this assumption that any Green Party voter is someone who would otherwise vote Democrat, I guess, which, I mean, it just doesn't really make any sense, because, I mean, like, the polling doesn't bear that out here. You see, I mean, if only half voted for Gore, I'm not even sure that would put him over the top. But especially if the other half voted for Bush, which, I mean, not saying that they would or not. I mean, some of them are just going to stay home, probably. But, because, yeah, there's a sense that's like, yeah, obviously they were going to come out and vote no matter what, and obviously they were going to vote for whatever candidate was on the ballot that was furthest to the left, but it's like none of that there's no evidence to support those assumptions, like either of those assumptions. And I mean, you never really know what is motivating a voter. Like I keep telling people, like, half the people who, no, I'm just making up a number, but half the people that voted for Trump did because they thought he was secretly arresting pedophiles. Like, you know, you can't draw like a straight line to be like, oh, they support him for this policy reason, or this is their politics, and that's what. Like, no, like people have whatever weird reasons that they have to vote for someone, so you can't just be like, they all would have voted for Gore otherwise. I mean, it makes as much sense as to say that to blame non-voters, because if they had gone, they would have voted for Gore or something, or you could even blame Bush voters and be like, they should have voted for Gore instead of Bush. Like, there's just, you know,
he seems like someone I could get a beer with.
I mean, anyone could vote for Gore, but just taking Nader off is not necessarily going to mean that Gore is going to win. I mean, to be fair, this article isn't as much blaming the voters as blaming Nader. Yes, I guess that was sort of okay that they were more going after Nader than the voters, even though I'm still not really with that. But I will give them, I guess, that some mild credit.
They weren't fully failing yet. The New York Times was still a little bit.
Yeah, they were still a couple of years away from their
crosswords were still on point. Well, I think just the point of saying that how much they like their vitriol towards Nader. One of the quotes that I had skipped at first, but from Amy Isaacs, the national director of the Americans for Democratic Action, his standing has been severely diminished by his actions. People basically view him as having been on a narcissistic, self-serving Sancho Panza windmill tilting exertion. Like, it's just like this dude with his thinking that we could be more left and have these ideals instead is a real fucking selfish prick. Fuck this dude. Like, there is something, I guess, maybe to being like running third party, knowing sort of that can, if you have a defeatist ideology in the beginning, that then it is self serving. But like, I mean, if you legitimately think like, hey man, like these are important values that should be like given some amount of presentation, then it's not like a narcissist trip. It's like a, hey, somebody has to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was another thing that was missing from this article was just there's like an assumption that Green Party voters would have gotten their policies across if they had only voted for Gore, but there's no actual assessment of what Nader or Gore's policies are. There's nothing to actually suggest that that's necessarily true. It's just sort of assumed that, like, well, Gore is somewhat on the left and Nader is somewhat on the left, so they must basically be for the same things. And obviously, the article can't cover everything, but that would have been nice to at least have some sort of acknowledgement of that. But I will say, too, in some ways, this is kind of the opposite of how I see the Stevenson-Eisenhower election. And I don't know, maybe someone who's an expert on that will tell me that that election did matter for some reason. But I actually think that the 2000 election may have been the most important election of our lifetimes. I know people say that about every election, but I'm specifically saying I think this one was because what is Gore going to do? Like all he does is climate change stuff pretty much. So I mean, that would have been interesting to see if he had been elected, would he still have had that same sort of focus on climate change? Because that could have been important. And then the other thing we get is then obviously 2001, you get 9/11. And there's some evidence to suggest that maybe 9/11 could have been prevented if Bush had taken the warnings more seriously. Not so again, like we can't know any of this for sure. I'm not saying one way or another. I'm just pointing out the stuff that happened. And then you obviously have the backlash to 9/11, which is the invasion of Iraq. Would Gore have invaded Iraq? Maybe, maybe not. And then obviously now we're sort of still bogged down in the Middle East to some extent. I mean, we've kind of drawn out a little bit, but not fully. And you get the recession at the end of Bush's presidency as well. Bush won the second term by running on, we can't change leaders in the middle of the war. So I mean, you just think of all those dominoes that sort of fall. So it's like I actually sort of think this maybe was the most important election, if you could say one election is the most important, which I think could raise an argument that maybe either Nader should have dropped out. People, again, not everyone who voted for Nader would have voted for Gore, but maybe if anyone was in that sort of position. But so I don't know. This is sort of an interesting case there. Where it's like if you believe voting for third party, I think this is the one you have to sort of look at to sort of say, or maybe 2020. I don't know if 2020 was most important or not, but.
Like two things about that. One, I have just sort of pulled up Nader's. I'll just read the line here. Nader campaigned against the pervasiveness of corporate power and spoke on the need for campaign finance reform. His campaign also addressed problems with the two-party system, voter fraud, environmental justice, universal health care, affordable housing, free education, including college, workers' rights, and increasing the minimum wage to a living wage. He also focused on the three-strike rule, exoneration for prisoners for drug-related nonviolent crimes, legalization of commercial hemp, and a shift in tax policies to place the burden more heavily on corporations and on the middle and lower classes. He opposed pollution credits and giveaways of publicly owned assets. So, listen, I might have voted Nader, but also, people were sort of worried about the well-being of gays and lesbians, minorities, and the poor, and women in organized labor. But so the next time we got a Democrat was Obama, who wouldn't even acknowledge gay people until 2013 or something. So maybe they wouldn't be as actively harmful, but they're no. I mean, Gore may or may not have been better than Obama at this if he was in the seat, but it's not like they're sticking their neck out and really being these huge champions. They're trying to be as milquetoast, middle of the road as possible to get them votes, and then once they can't get elected again, then they'll be like, oh yeah, I got 3 years, I can maybe try to do something, but Guantanamo's still open, bro.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'll just say for me at least that we're talking about voting. I guess we could talk about what we did if you want, but I did end up voting for Biden this time around in 2020. after I voted green last time. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One, without saying too much, I live in a swing state for this election, whereas I did not for last one. And I also do think Trump pretty much just encouraging his supporters to execute people in the streets if they were suspicious of them for
Now. We're still standing back and standing by. We haven't even given the order yet. So you don't know what we're waiting to be told to do. So let's not jump ahead of ourselves.
I do think that was, something where, maybe if we think about what elections matter, like I said, I think I would be curious if you could, somehow teleport Du Bois to 2020 to see if he would still sort of have that same question of, if you're voting for this person, why? If you're voting for that person, why? Because I don't think, with Stevenson and Eisenhower, if anything, they seem to sort of just be too non-committal. I mean, I'm sure we would, from our 2020 view, we would look and just, say that they're being racist or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that they weren't racist, but I think it seemed, I'm not in Du Bois's head either, but it seemed like a lot of what he was talking about was just people, candidates being too non-committal and things like that. But one thing you can't say about Trump is that he's non-committal. Like you could definitely see
absolutely.
where Trump was standing on racism. So I do wonder if even Du Bois maybe would have thought twice about not voting. But in general, I mean, I'll just say I think people who don't live in swing states, I think if you support a third party, I don't really think there's much reason not to vote for them. Again, this election was a little bit weird because of Trump also saying that he was going to steal the election. So I think there was some motivation for people who didn't live in swing states to still just try and overwhelm the system. But sorry, go ahead.
I'm pretty sure the Biden crime family stole the election, if I'm hearing this right, from select news press conferences. But I mean, personally, I was also a Jill to Joe pipeline from 2016 to 2020. But I am not in a swing state. However, I was of the sort of later thing of like, listen, like Trump's already going to be way too salty about it. So like, I just got to like make sure there's like not anywhere close to a question of the fact that he got his poop pushed in.
That he had his what?
A la the election. He got his poop pushed in.
I kind of thought that's what you said, but
I thought that's what you said. I was really hoping that if I asked you again, you'd say anything else, but you just said it twice. So,
overall, I think there is some sort of maybe calculation to be made between voting your conscience and maybe treating your vote a little bit more strategically. I honestly, I think 9 times out of 10, the election doesn't have drastic impact on the direction of the country. I mean, honestly, even Trump's first term didn't really have that too drastic of an impact on sort of the American project broadly conceived. But I think the perhaps legitimate fear was just that. I mean, and another obviously, it almost goes without saying, but is actually worth saying, is that we're in the middle of this pandemic that Trump has completely botched, and in some ways, this is literally a life or death choice. I mean, not that I'm a fan of Biden, but I do think he would handle this pandemic a lot better than Trump, even if it's just something as simple as not questioning the effectiveness of masks would go probably a long way. Obviously, there's a lot more you could do. The fact that he doesn't support universal health care is going to kill a lot of people, but there's just a lot of reasons that this election you could argue has some significance that other ones don't necessarily have. And so in that way, too, I think these artifacts sort of pair well. They're sort of a contrast of elections and also sort of ways to think about elections as well. I mean, at the end, I'm sort of vote for whoever you want. I mean, mean, don't vote for Republicans, but vote for whoever.
Just please go out and vote. I don't care who you vote for as long as it's not Republican. Just vote for whoever.
Yeah.
Just go out and vote. Voting's important, not Republican.
I don't vote shame anyone except for if you vote Republican or Libertarian, then I will vote shame you.
Oof.
But yeah, so I mean, as long as you are, I think you probably should vote overall.
Not Republican.
Yeah. Only
assuming it's relatively left.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, like, I think it's your right not to vote, and I do think you should
Especially
be
if
able
you're Republican.
you should be able to exercise that right. But overall, I think more often than not, it's at least in your interest to vote. But I do think you should vote for who you want to, not necessarily who you think you should vote for. But that's just my 2 cents. So do whatever you want. Just don't vote Republican.
Yeah, do whatever you want as long as you vote left.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could, if you want to vote Libertarian, I guess,
I was going to say, I can listen. They're not all pedophiles. They're just sort of pedophile adjacent, so it's fine.
I mean, it's a stupid vote, but at least you're not at risk of doing too much harm to anyone with the vote, so.
True. Except for the legal age of consent. Other than that, no harm.
I just mean they're not going to win, so.
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right, we've been on this for a while, so.
Yeah, libertarians deserve a safe room, too.
All right, Alex, now that we're in the safe room, what do you have on your mind?
So in my mind, we're back at it again in the workplace. Not necessarily etiquette, I guess, but just it's so much better for me personally and for everybody, because I'm correct, to have malicious and like shitty coworkers that are bad people but good coworkers than to have more affable but wholly incompetent coworkers. If you ever have to be like, how's this person? Like, well, she's nice. Run for the hills. It's not it. Because even if you're shitty and like you're like a bad person or you're like a dick or like a pain in the ass, like personality wise, but you can like get your job done and not get in my way, that's so much better than like someone being like, how was your weekend? But then like I have to like come in an hour later and do all the work that you should have been doing because you're like bad at your job. Like I would rather you be like a dick and good at your job than a nice person that's bad at your job, because like we're not friends. Coworkers are coworkers first, always. Friendliness and like friendship is like you got to be there anyways. Like it's such a bad useless thing to like hang your hat on. It is like exclusively like a labor contract. Like don't ever let anybody get it twisted. Just keep the priorities straight. I mean, that's the long and short of it. I can't stand when I like am like roasting a coworker with somebody else that like I'm like cool with, and they're also a good worker, and they're like, yeah, but she's like cool and she was nice, like like whatever. Like I don't give it. Like that's not. That's a bad defense. It's such a shitty, useless thing to say. It's kind of like, well, yeah, but like, sure, Trump won the electoral college, but Hillary got more popular votes. I don't give. Who gives a fuck? That's not what we're doing right now. Maybe it should be important, but like not what we're doing right now. If we work at a co-op, maybe, but like not. That's not what's happening right now. Like this is minimum wage, and she's like making me work harder. Especially if it's like upper management, like the higher up and the dumber you are, which is sort of seems to coalesce a lot, but like it's just a bad look. Like if you have an incompetent manager, like there's nothing worse in the world. And an incompetent nice manager, I would rather you have like the tightest scheduling and like everything's ordered when it needs to be, and also like anytime I see you, you're just like fuck you, like that's fine, I'll take that every day of the week. Then ask me how my weekend is, but you have me 2 days that I'm supposed to be scheduled off, like working for like 12-hour shifts. Like it's just.
It depends on the job. I think for I'll just for like a lower level entry job, or basically if it's a job that I mean not disparage any jobs, but if it's a job that you don't care as much about or are comfortable leaving at the drop of a pin, then I totally agree that malicious
that
is
should be
better.
every job. Our labor is the capital, dude. You don't understand.
Well, whatever. We don't have to derail ourselves. I think there's other ways to imagine work that we don't have right now. But so anyways, but
Fair enough.
in that case where it's a job you don't care about, then yes, I'll take malicious because you can always buck back and you can always, sure, they tell you mop the floor or whatever, and you can sort of be like, pay me more money or whatever. Like, I don't know. Like,
You owe me money, dude.
I guess I'm sort of assuming that any maliciousness will be associated with some level of incompetence that you can exploit. I mean, I do think that, you could always risk of, fighting back and then they get rid of you or whatever. So I'm not saying you should always do that. Because I think incompetence can sort of be nice, too, if there's, like, a certain level of stability. Because, like, I do also think you can sort of take advantage of a situation where the person is not really paying attention.
Oh, exploitable incompetence is a godsend. But
Yeah.
like if it's harming your ability to work or giving you more work to do, inexcusable.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I do sort of agree with your overall point that sort of like being nice or perceived as nice or whatever is definitely overrated. At the end of the day, you're there to get paid. I mean, hopefully you don't hate your job just because you have to spend some amount of time there. Yeah, but your job doesn't have to be like some sort of wellness moment for you or something necessarily. Like, it can just be something that you do to survive, and then when you leave is when you do the things that you want to do for yourself. Like, I think that's also fine.
What's your what do you got, Justin? What's your safe room, bud?
My safe room is that you should say what you mean, or alternatively, a case for radical honesty. To protect the innocent here, I'm going to change these stories a bit. So these are not true stories, and they also I wouldn't do this stuff during COVID anyway. So I'll just emphasize they're not true. They get across the same intention as true stories, as they're based on true stories in that way. But you can start thinking about them as analogies or whatever if you want. But so in one, so these involve some of my friends, and in one we were trying to get together to play a board game, and one friend basically was just like saying he didn't want to come because he had a test that he had to study for the next day, and it's like fine, whatever. But then the next week it's like, we still want to try out this board game though, and then he would just say, oh, I have another test this week. And then just like week after week of being like, oh, I want to join you for this board game, but I have a test tomorrow. I just can't do it. So it's like, okay, like at some point, we're not stupid. It's like, all right, obviously this person is just avoiding us. But at the same time, we don't care enough to like, cause like a scene over it. It's just like, all right, whatever, he doesn't want to play, I guess. But then finally, like, I don't even know, probably like 3 months later, whatever, we're just like, yeah, remember when you were like lying about having all those tests? And then he finally just admits, like, yeah, he didn't actually ever want to play the game because he thought, he didn't think he would be like good enough at it or something. And it's like, just say that then. It's like, so obvious that like you didn't have a test every week. Like, what? Like, there's no reason to like pretend that you did. But and then there was another one where we had all agreed to go to a restaurant together. Like, we're like, all right, like next week, let's go to this restaurant. And then the day before, and we're just like, all right, we still good to go to this restaurant. And then all of a sudden, one of my friends was like, no, actually, I think I want to go to this other restaurant instead. It's like, again, it's like one of the situations. It's like, I don't really care which restaurant we go to, but also like just what happened. Like, we had all agreed to this. Like, why all of a sudden now are you like, so in favor of going to this other restaurant? And then, so we go see that restaurant, and then later I had another friend tell me like, oh, like basically what happened is he like met this girl that was working as a waitress at that other restaurant, and he was hoping that she would be there. I mean, she wasn't even on shift that night, so like it didn't even matter. Again, it's like, just say that. Like, I'm not going to like judge you for that or whatever. Like, it doesn't really affect me. I'm still getting food either way. Like, So yeah, I
Right.
think that just like the point of these stories is just that. Yeah, I think this sort of like obfuscation just sort of doesn't help anything. With one
Mm-hmm.
caveat, I will say I do think another place we see this often is like in the dating world, where people will be like, oh, they'll be like, oh, do you want to get dinner? And the person will be like, oh, I'm working a night shift or whatever, and they're just not. But I do
Mm-hmm.
appreciate that, there's always risk of, how's this person going to handle rejection? Are they going to like
Right.
become violent or whatever? So I'm not saying like never lie. I'm not saying like, you have to tell the truth even if it's going to put you in like immediate danger or something like that. So, there's a limit to the sort of radical honesty, but overall, if it's not going to necessarily put you in danger, like there's not a reason to like just be erring on the side of lie and deny. Like you gotta like consider what the stakes are, and if the stakes are just like maybe your friend teases you for a second, like that's not really like a great reason.
Or is it the only reason?
Well, it's like you gotta think of the trade off too. It's like now I think that you're a liar. Like I can just tell you're
Right.
lying, and like also either I'll just go on thinking you're a liar, or eventually I'm gonna call you out, and then you're gonna have to tell
Right.
the truth anyway. So it's like, what are you really gaining out of the situation?
Or do you just deny to the bitter end and sort of burn all bridges behind you without ever looking back, proudly and gleefully?
Yeah, I mean, again, you could do that, but then you're gonna be out of friends at some point because it's like, yeah, remember
Worth it.
like that dude who was really weird and kept saying he had a test every single week? Like, whatever happened to that? Oh yeah, we like stopped hanging out with him. Like, that's just how that's going to
Right.
end. So it's like, is that really like worth whatever benefit you think you're going to get from that? And overall, I think we can just like make a new like we just need to establish like better cultural norms around this, where it's like I think we're just afraid of like causing even like momentary conflict or abrasion. So it's like we're just
Right.
trying to like avoid it. But it's like the example I sort of came up with to sort of illustrate this is just like don't like just walk up to someone and be like, I think your haircut sucks. But like if someone were to like ask you like what do you think of my haircut, like there's not a reason to like just give into your impulse and be like, oh, it's good even though it sucks. Like you're both going to
Right.
benefit long term if you're just like honest in like those types of situations. So that's
If
a
anybody ever asks you for your opinion and it's a negative one, you need is your right and like your duty to go nuclear because then the answer is always like, listen, you asked, bro. Like I wasn't gonna say shit about your dumb haircut. You asked. You look like a fucking piece of shit. Like you got absolutely beat up by a gang of lawnmowers, dude. That's not on me. You asked, bro.
I'm not even going that far, so you gotta go nuclear. Just be
If they
honest.
ask you, no, if they ask you and they give you that, and you, the perfect defense is you ask. No, Justin, this all right. You've run out of nuance. You're wrong now. No. Fuck them up. Absolutely fuck them up if they ask for your opinion. Make them regret asking for your opinion. Honestly.
All right, we diverged there. We diverged there. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's just about having new, like I said, cultural norms where it's like we gotta break out of this cycle of just like being like polite lies or even just yeah. I don't. Some of these lies are not even necessarily like polite lies. I don't know what they really are, but just this knee jerk to like err on the side of like lying. Like yeah, this I don't know.
Right.
That's our show for this week. See the show notes for a link to view the artifacts for yourself and to view the end notes as well.
Artwork by JAS Art Studios and music was produced by Nicholas Pizzuto.
Rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Facebook, and tell a friend or enemy about the show. And join us again in 3 weeks as we find 2 new texts to discuss. I don't know if at the end of hearing us talking for 45 minutes, if what people are waiting on is are more hot takes from us. It's like, man, I wish I could just
It's
get
real.
3 more hot takes from each of them. Like,
Oh, maybe, but maybe. But maybe. Well, it would be things that weren't long enough to justify safe room, but still need to be said. And I think I get so well. I'm gonna use these now because it's not gonna be relevant. These are very topical for the episode. We don't have to air. I just want your opinion on these. What would you have said if this was a standard part of the podcast? Ready?
Okay.
Overrated, underrated. The Electoral College.
Underrated, I guess.
It's your call. I don't know what your opinion is. Overrated, underrated, or perfectly rated. Those are your three options.
Or so perfectly. Oh, I didn't know perfectly rated was an option. Maybe I'll go perfectly rated then.
The first Black Asian female VP.
Overrated.
Kissing your granddaughter on the lips.
Kissing your
at a political convention.
Are you talking about specifically Joe Biden?
Yes, that's the.
Well, I'm just saying because I feel like it depends.
Kissing your granddaughter on the lips at a publicly televised event while running for president.
I'll say underrated.
You want to speak on that?
I feel like no one is in favor. Well, I feel like not really anyone is in favor of it, and so, but it's not like the worst thing in the world. So definitionally, it is